Welcome to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less Show, episode number 60, July 8th, 2021. My name is Andy Zee. I'm the host of the show, and I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California. This is a show about revolution. That is what humanity needs. And over the last few months, every week, we have brought to you and gone deeply into a very important document, a declaration, a call to get organized now for a real revolution. This declaration, a call, says, for the masses of people, and ultimately for humanity as a whole, there is no future, or no future worth living, under this system. A declaration, a call, then dives into why a revolution could be possible now, and what we need to do to organize the forces for that revolution. I want to encourage everyone to get into this urgent document. It is available on our website, revcom.us, and here on the RNL Show, we did a close read with explanation in our 52nd episode, and we're going to link to that episode in the description below. At the heart of the RNL Revolution Nothing Less Show is the leadership and the work of Bob Avakian, B.A. Bob Avakian became a revolutionary in the heart and the heat of the 1960s, and he never turned back. When others who had been revolutionaries gave up in one way or another, when revolutions in other parts of the world were turned back and defeated by the workings of this system, Bob Avakian dug deep into why, to find the path to go forward, drawing crucial lessons from the historical experience, both the liberating breakthroughs as well as the errors and shortcomings of revolutions throughout the world. This has enormous implications for making revolution to emancipate humanity. And the import of this comes through in an in-depth interview I did today with Raymond Lotta, who has written an important article on the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China that is on our website, revcom.us. And this article goes into how that party, which under the leadership of Mao Zedong led a revolution that won victory in 1949 and made revolutionary China for 27 years a beacon of liberation to the people of the world. Then, in 1976, it was defeated from within by a coup that set China on the road to becoming a capitalist country. It was Bob Avakian who first analyzed what happened, when most others who had taken inspiration from revolutionary China could not see or refused to see or accept that this had happened. Bob Avakian, B.A., fought to enable people all over the world to understand this, to regroup, to reforge revolutionary purpose, to emancipate humanity. Most of all, through all of this, he went to work further developing the science of communism. He made a giant breakthrough in the understanding and the approach that the masses of oppressed people here and around the world need to make the revolution they need. A revolution to emancipate themselves and all of humanity, a revolution whose goal is the new communism. Today, when the masses of people here and around the world are suffering terribly, and when there is a possibility of making a revolution, we need to recognize that there has never been a leader like this in this country, and there is no other leader like this in the world now. Look, we cannot afford not to follow this leadership if we ever want to get free and put an end to this madness, as it is put in the declaration and call of which I just spoke. I want to welcome Sansara Taylor, co-host of the RNL Show, and we're going to run down for you what today's program is going to be.
Yeah, so many of you who are watching have probably seen the headlines in recent weeks of mass graves that have been found in Canada filled with the remains of Indigenous children. We are going to bring you a new installment of the American Crime series that we've been running here at the RNL Revolution Nothing Less Show, originally published at revcom.us and adapted into segments here on this show by the filmmaker David Zeiger. This week, we're bringing you the story of the boarding schools that were part of the cultural genocide of Native Americans in Canada, but also here in the United States. So that's going to be a very good segment at the end of the show. Before that,
we're going to be showing Sansara a film clip from Bob Avakian's 2012 speech, B.A. Speaks, Revolution Nothing Less, from which we take our name, a short, incisive piece titled, "Which System, Capitalism or Communism, is the Nightmare for Humanity?" And this will then be followed and lead into the interview I do with Raymond Lotta.
And to get us into our show today, we're really pleased here at the RNL Show to bring you a poem that was written and performed by a true friend of the Revolution Nothing Less show, and actually a champion of this show. Roosevelt is a member of the Revolution Club in Chicago, where he works with the club there to take out this revolution in the leadership of Bob Avakian to all strata of people, but especially to the youth who live the hardest life and who need to become part of the backbone forces of this revolution. We actually had Roosevelt on our show on the 3rd episode, right when we were getting started. He came on and we did an interview with him, which we'll also link to in the description, where he talked about the protest that he helped lead outside the infamous Cook County Jail, a horrendous jail where prisoners were dying of COVID, housed in unsanitary conditions with no basic protections. He led that protest with others, and he also opened up about his own bitter experience. Years behind bars, including the torture of solitary confinement. He shared this, as well as some truly heroic and inspiring experience of leading struggle against those conditions from within the walls of the hellholes of this country. So we're very happy to have him back on the RNL Show and to kick off today's episode with this poem that he did. Let's watch.
I have to go at this the only way I know how. Whenever I'm asked about the RNL Show. You see, we wanted to see more. We really wanted to see more. We wanted to see more from elected officials who bribed us with sweet barbed wire words and got before these cameras and lied about changes that would never happen. We wanted to see more. We really wanted to see more from the preachers who, through the love of Jesus Christ, encouraged us to stand up and confess with all our hearts a belief in Christ, to fight with all our hearts for the love of Christ, but to stand in complete total silence when humanity was at stake. We wanted to see more. We really wanted to see more from our leaders and some activists who marched and chanted about never giving up to this one-sided ass slave owner's constitution and then turned right around and took a knee with the very same oppressors who put them in jail or murdered their loved ones or them the very next day. We wanted to see more, and we saw more when we tuned into the RNL Show on YouTube at the Rev Club and saw those in the Revolution Club give solid information about COVID-19 that took the lives of some 4 million people. We wanted to see more, and we saw more on the RNL Show as they described scene after scene of immigrants being subjected to horrendous situations trying to flee from conditions created by a monstrous system. We wanted to see more, and we saw more as the RNL Show stood on the truth about the 5 stops and the POAs and the road humanity must take. We wanted to see more, and we saw more as the RNL Show presented hard-hitting facts on each subject humanity is facing while others failed to hit the mark. This is a show worth watching and telling others about, with solutions which only BA Bob Avakian presents to you on how you can become a fighter against a system that has no true love for humanity in its youth. And you too will see why the RNL Show is the most informative show on any channel. We wanted to see more. Now we can really dig into it and see more.
I want to express my really deep appreciation to Roosevelt for that poem. I want to recognize the challenge that presents to myself and the whole crew here at the RNL Show to live up to what he says that he and others can get from this show, that we present the truth and the hard-hitting facts on the reality that people face. He says that this is a show worth watching and telling others about. That's a challenge to all of you. And that there's solutions on this show. and that Bob Avakian presents to you how you can become a fighter against this system that has no true love for humanity and its youth. So now we're going to show you a film clip from Bob Avakian's speech in 2012, BA Speaks, Revolution Nothing Less, from which we take our name. It's a short and very incisive piece titled, Which System, Capitalism or Communism, is the Nightmare for Humanity? And then this piece will lead right into the interview I do with Raymond Lotta on the 100th anniversary of the CPC, the Communist Party of China.
So here is some of what this person raised in his feedback. They wrote, people in this society, and probably some people in the room, have all kinds of ideas about communism. Maybe they even say, okay, I'm with you. This world is really fucked up. People suffer in all kinds of ways. There are all these outrages. But people say that communism has just been a horror, a disaster, that maybe it's a good idea on paper, but it has only been a nightmare in practice. And then they went on. To this, I have a few things to say. First, capitalism-imperialism is the real nightmare for humanity, and it's not even a good idea on paper. Second, where does this idea come from that communism is a nightmare? It comes from the politicians who run this capitalist-imperialist system, from the people who decide and control what is and is not taught in the schools, from the media mouthpieces of this system and this system's intellectual hitmen. In other words, from the very people who rule over and enforce this capitalist-imperialist system and who have told lie after lie after lie to defend this system. These are the people you're going to trust to tell you about communism? And then they went on. All this would be bad enough. But then for the last few decades, even many progressive voices, including those who once knew better, have gotten bamboozled or bullied to the point where they no longer know and speak the truth about communism. And this creates a situation where everybody knows that communism is a nightmare, when in reality, very few people know anything about what communism actually is and what the actual experience of the communist revolution has been. So they go on, let's talk about that. And here, they say, are a few examples I thought of. The contrast between the 10 million children who die every year under this system from starvation and preventable disease, and the fact that in socialist China, they had solved the food problem so that everyone had enough to eat within 20 years. So remind me, which system is the nightmare for humanity? Or how about the contrast between the situation for women under this system, the millions who are raped and beaten every year, the extreme degradation and enslavement concentrated in pornography and sex trafficking, up against the unprecedented emancipatory advances for women during the first wave of communist revolution in Russia and China. Remind me again, which system is a nightmare for humanity? Or let's contrast the dominant art and culture of this society, real housewives of this or that, and the all too putrid culture that comes through in way too much of hip-hop and so-called stand-up comedy today, up against the revolutionary art and culture that was brought forward through the Cultural Revolution in China, and the prominent role of women and overcoming women's oppression in that art and culture. Remind me once more, which system is the nightmare for humanity? Or contrast the staggering mass incarceration, especially of oppressed nationalities in this country, up against the steps that were taken in Russia to overcome the oppression of minority nationalities. One more time, remind me which system is the nightmare for humanity?
On July 1st, China celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, the CPC. a party that began with a secret meeting of 13 revolutionaries on July 23rd, 1921. This was a party of revolution from its founding up until 1976, when Mao Zedong died, and there was a counter-revolution that overthrew socialism in China and set it on the road to becoming a capitalist and imperialist country that it is today, with all the horrors that means for the masses of people. In 1949, upon the victory of the revolution, with the founding of the People's Republic of China, Mao said the Chinese people have stood up. Over the next 27 years, the revolution blazed a path of liberation that inspired people all over the world. But then, as I said, this was turned back. China transformed into a major capitalist imperialist country, contending with the U.S. for domination in the world. Raymond Lotta, who I will speak to in just a moment, wrote a piece on this anniversary that says, quote, "The leader of China, Xi Jinping, and other leaders of the ruling Communist Party of China, the CPC, pretend that there is an unbroken chain from the founding Congress of the party in July 1921 to the present-day CPC. Theirs is a story of the CPC realizing its mission of turning China into a major world power that will not bend to foreign will or threat." And on the other hand, and at the same time, the article says the U.S. imperialists and other Western imperialist powers promote their own version of this unbroken chain. Theirs is a story of an historically authoritarian party that from its very inception has sought to control lives and dominate the world. And the news coverage of the celebrations promoted the Chinese leaders' bloody threats against any country who challenges them, while U.S. President Biden, in his first address to Congress, said that the battle of our time is against authoritarianism, clearly signifying China as well as Russia. And Biden, over the last few weeks, has been working to forge a coalition with Europe against China. We may return in future episodes to the international dimension of this big power rivalry and conflict between these contending imperialist powers. But today, many people are confused by the fact that China calls itself socialist and is ruled by a communist party, and yet is a major capitalist nation. So to speak to this, again, we are very pleased to have Raymond Lotta, a writer for RevCom.us, a co-spokesman for Revolution Books in New York City, along with myself, and an advocate for the new communism and the leadership of Bob Avakian. His article is on the website RevCom.us, and it's titled "China's Commemoration of the 100th Anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, not the Party of Mao and Revolution, but of Counterrevolution and Capitalism-Imperialism." Welcome, Raymond, to the RNL Show.
Hey, Andy, thanks for having me on.
All right, great. So, Raymond, you wrote in this article, quote, "These 100 years since the founding of the CPC, the Communist Party of China, have not been an unbroken chain, but rather a matter of struggle between revolution and counter-revolution." Could you speak to this briefly? Explain what you mean.
Right. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 in Shanghai. And the storyline, as you say, that's peddled by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party today is that this is a continuum from the founding of the party to today, and that the party has fulfilled or is fulfilling its mission of turning China into a modern industrial power that's taking its place in the community of nations and will not be bullied or threatened by anyone. And the fact of the matter is that this is not the same party that Mao Zedong led from 1935 to 1976. This is not the party of revolution, of socialism, of communism. This is not the party that under Mao actually led hundreds of millions of people to cast off, to drive out imperialism, to shatter the rule of feudalism, and to embark on the socialist road. In 1976, a counter-revolution took place in China. Its leadership was within the Communist Party. Capitalist voters, counter-revolutionaries, they seized power. They staged a military coup d'etat in 1976 and overthrew the rule of the revolution, the proletariat, and put China on the road that it's on now, which is a fully capitalist society. This is not the party of Mao. This is not the party of revolution.
So let's jump forward here. We had the revolution in 1949, and they begin to build socialism, and this struggle is continuing in the early years of this revolution. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then let's move up to the 1960s.
Yeah, and when the revolution came to power in 1949, the conditions in China were such that you had a country of 500 million people, but only 12,000 doctors trained in modern medicine. You had 60 million opium addicts. You had, in the city of Shanghai, 25,000 bodies that were picked up off the streets every year. So the revolution went to work immediately, on creating a new economy that was organized around the needs of the people. Mm-hmm. And it went to work on creating a medical system that could train doctors, and infrastructure for health, an educational system. And, these were great strides that were being made. But within the Communist Party, that 1949 moment was seen very differently by the revolutionary forces and the communist forces. For Mao, this was the beginning of the revolution. And for the other forces, and these were capitalist rotors, as Mao described them and analyzed them, revisionists. For them, 1949 was really the end of the revolution from the standpoint of political, social, and ideological struggle. For them, the task was to build China into a modern industrial country, to create armies of technicians and experts, to create an educational system that would generate a new elite. For them, the task was to focus on industrial economic development and to focus that development in the cities. And Mao was saying, yes, we have to develop the economy. Yes, we need to raise living standards, but we have to be doing that from the perspective of advancing this revolution, overcoming the inequalities between the town and the country, between people that work with their hands and people that are mainly engaged in administrative and intellectual activity. So there was very sharp struggle over what road would China be going on, a socialist road towards overcoming all oppression and exploitation, and China being a base of support for revolution, or as these capitalist rotors were viewing the situation, mainly, let's build the economy, let's create elites in education, in health, in other spheres, industrial management, and this will all trickle down to benefit the people. This was a very sharp struggle from the very beginning. And by the mid-1960s, these counter-revolutionary forces, these capitalist rotors, were gaining enormous strength. Their policies in terms of running factories, where there was what was called one-man management, very authoritarian management in the factories. Workers were being motivated, with bonuses, with incentives. Just keep your nose to the grindstone and work, and everything will be taken care of. And this was a program not of revolution, but of capitalist development masquerading as efficient socialism. And by 1965, these forces had, as I said, accrued enormous strength and influence at the top levels of the party, within the government, within the planning agencies. And Mao was saying the revolution is now at a fatal turning point. It will either hold on, and we have to do extraordinary things to prevent these capitalist rotors from seizing power all out, or they are going to win. And this sets the stage for the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, I think it's important that you are describing, and I want to just underscore for our listeners, this is not like some people stood up on one side and say, we're for capitalism, and somebody else stood up and said, well, we're for communism. But these were actually trying to solve real world problems with two different programs, two different world outlooks that took time to mature as they face new problems. And then I think it's important you brought up that by 1965, this was coming to a head, including that Mao had looked at the Soviet Union, which had also been a socialist country, but the revolution had been reversed and became a capitalist country itself. And this was something that Mao then confronted and then proposed a totally new thing in human history, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. So I'm wondering if you could just briefly talk about that and what an achievement of what, particularly hitting what Mao's great insight was on that led to the Cultural Revolution. And then let's go, then I do want to take time to get to how this capitalist party developed in China after, as you described earlier, through a coup d'etat. So let's just get a little bit into this Cultural Revolution and Mao's greatest contribution.
Yeah, this was, the contribution that Mao made was twofold. One was an actual analysis of how it is that new bourgeois capitalist forces arise within socialist society and how it is that their apex of power, their fulcrum of strength, if you will, is at the top levels of the Communist Party itself, because the Communist Party plays an outsized role in society, giving leadership and direction. And then it is the planning agencies that are taking responsibility for the direction of the economy, and then there's the state system, and you have communists within these spheres of society, and especially with the Communist Party, which is giving this leadership and direction, and which mobilizes forces. So Mao made an analysis of how it was that the danger of capitalist restoration existed in socialist society, not mainly coming, although it could, not that foreign powers are coming or that old landlords and old capitalists are, bringing back their deeds and certificates of ownership, but that capitalism takes the form of a state capitalism, a form that is very difficult to understand just by looking at it because it has, the trappings of socialism. It claims socialist ownership. So Mao was penetrating beneath this to make this analysis of how it is that capitalism arises within socialist society. So on the one hand, there was the analysis of the danger of and the sources of capitalist restoration, and the other was the methods of struggle. That this was not something that was solved in the Soviet Union, as you correctly pointed to. And what Mao was saying is that we need what can only be described, Andy, as a second revolution. And the Cultural Revolution was something unheard of in the history of the communist movement. What Mao called upon the people to do was to rise up, to overthrow these capitalist rotors. And the purpose of the Cultural Revolution was both to overthrow these capitalist rotors and to further revolutionize the institutions of society. Whether we're talking about the schools, the healthcare system, the realms of culture. This is what the Cultural Revolution was about. It was to overthrow these capitalist rotors and to continue to deepen the revolution in the direction of uprooting all oppression and exploitation. And what Mao was saying is that if we're going to develop the economy, we have to develop it in a way that overcomes the inequalities between the town and the countryside, between mental and manual labor. And I just want to say this about the Cultural Revolution. It was not an orgy of chaos, violence, and persecution. Not only did it have coherent goals, Andy, in the way that I'm describing, there were methods that Mao was advocating and fighting for in the Cultural Revolution. And the key methods were mass debate, opening these questions up about the socialist road versus the capitalist road. What does it mean, to create a revolutionary system of education or healthcare? How do we create a revolutionary culture? How do we involve the masses of workers and peasants in running the communes and the factories? What are the correct forms of management? And there was experimentation. So there were coherent goals of the Cultural Revolution, and there were coherent methods. Mass debate, mass criticism of these capitalist rotors, and mass mobilization of people in struggle to overthrow these capitalist rulers, demonstrations. And when I talked about mass debate, there were wall posters, there were mass meetings. This was an incredible experience. Nothing like it had ever happened in the history of the world, if you will. And this was a tremendous inspiration. What was happening in China, the changes in the educational system, in the healthcare system, this was a tremendous inspiration to people throughout the world. You know, the Black Panther Party in the United States, the women's liberation movement, student radicals, a new generation of communist revolutionaries were inspired and were taking direction. What Mao was saying is the revolution doesn't end when you seize power. It has to deepen, and it has to go in the direction of what Marx called achieving the two radical ruptures, rupturing with all traditional property relations, systems of exploitation, and rupturing with all traditional ideas and values. It's about changing people and changing society and moving towards a communist world free of all exploitation and oppression. And these were two different views of revolution and communism. For Mao, this was about emancipating humanity. And for these capitalist rulers, it was about an efficient economy, an efficient state system. It was about creating new inequalities, that were in the service of economic development. And it was economic development that was actually capitalist development. And this was what was being fought out during the Cultural Revolution. And for 10 years, there was this experimentation. For 10 years, there was this mass struggle that prevented capitalist restoration. But in 1976, these capitalist rulers had the strength and the organization to stage a military coup d'etat after Mao died in September 1976. And they arrested his closest leading followers, and they transformed the Communist Party into a repressive instrument of capitalist rule.
Well, I feel your passion for that moment in history, that is something that people need to get into much more deeply and understand what was actually going on. I think I just wanted to underscore one point before we move on, which is that you really are talking about two different world outlooks. That a key part of this revolution was transforming how people thought about society and how they thought about themselves, and seeing themselves as the agents of change, of getting beyond just looking out for oneself or even just one's country, but putting themselves, I think one of the slogans that one of the slogans they have was "Serve the People," and that was a very important slogan that did inspire the Black Panther Party. It did inspire all kinds of radicals all over the world, and not just serve the people through social reforms, but serve the people by casting off the yoke of capital, thinking about all of humanity, seeing how we could get beyond all of this. And there really was a tremendous struggle over world outlook, and this struggle continues today in very sharp forms, and that's part of what we're engaged in today, in terms of even with this show, and as it's been further developed with the new Communism by Bob Avakian, developed by Bob Avakian. But I do want to just get to this next point in our show, which in this interview, which is that, as you said, in 1976, after Mao died, there was a coup d'etat and power was seized by those persons in the Communist Party, particularly in leadership, who wanted to develop China. And I think we should just briefly talk about this, including maybe you could, the slogan that the architect of this first transformation, Deng Xiaoping, had, "To get rich is glorious," and that represented a different world outlook than "serve the people." And at least characterize this so people can understand why it is that their cell phones are being made in China, why it is that China is the engine that drives Walmart, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we should, and that this party has nothing in common with what came before under the rule of the revolutionaries in the Communist Party. So I think we should just at least briefly set this up for people so that the truth of what we're actually confronting in China today can be clear to our audience.
Yeah, well, it's very true what you say. You can contrast these two world outlooks, serve the people, which was the ethos that was being fought for during the Cultural Revolution. And this was a benchmark, an ideological benchmark by which masses of people were evaluating leadership, were evaluating and interrogating themselves, their neighbors, and others. What are we doing this for? There's a story that's told, and about in a commune where a female peasant is interviewed, and she says, "I'm raising pigs for the world revolution." Their sights were being, were on the world and how this revolution was contributing to that. Yet today, China is an utterly different economy and society. The economy is organized around profit. It's organized around the most efficient means of producing profit. And if that means sweatshops, it means sweatshops. If that means polluting rivers, it means polluting rivers. And that is the case. China has among the most polluted rivers in the world, among the most polluted cities in the world. There is, vast, rampant prostitution. Women have been turned into sexual objects, in a huge, prostitution industry in China. That, slogan of the Chinese Revolution that was coined by Mao, women hold up the sky, is not...
Hold up half the sky.
Hold up half the sky is not the ethos, of China today. You have savage inequalities, among the highest rates of wealth inequality. You have millionaires and billionaires. It's just a joke that anyone would consider this to be a socialist society. It is not. And the first, what happened in terms of the overthrow of socialist of revolutionary rule and of the socialist society after this counter-revolution in October 1976, you have a whole new regimen of economic management, and then you have the breakup of the communes in the countryside, a mass migration of landless people driven into the cities. They become a labor force for sweatshops set up by international capital. Yes, Target, Walmart, Apple, the computer companies, these sweatshops, on the coast of China, on the eastern coast of China, have some of the most deplorable conditions that one could imagine. It was so bad in one that this was one of the Apple subcontractors, that you had workers who were jumping off the roof to commit suicide as a form of protest. This is not socialism. This is the counter-revolution in power. And now the new capitalist class that Mao was targeting for the Cultural Revolution has evolved into an imperialist ruling class. And it now has investments in Latin America and Africa. This is the situation that has developed because of this counter-revolution that took place in 1976. China has gone from being a beacon of revolution to being this kind of society organized around profit and exploitation. And this is a terrible, terrible tragedy, the loss of this socialist society, this socialist state. And Bob Avakian went to work in 1977 analyzing how it was that this happened, what was underlying this. And these are lessons that we have to learn from and internalize very deeply. And Bob Avakian has not only summed up the great achievements and the shortcomings of the Chinese Revolution, but looked at the entire sweep of this first stage of communist revolution and distilled the great advances of its leaders in their insights and their understanding, defended that first wave from slander and attack, and at the same time, pinpointed problems, even serious problems in method and approach, and ruptured with what needs to be ruptured with. And through this process, Bob Avakian, has developed the new communism that provides the framework for humanity to initiate a new wave of revolution in the 21st century.
Well, thank you, Raymond. I just want to underscore what it meant to people around the world, revolutionary forces around the world, in 1977, that Bob Avakian made the analysis that there had been a coup in China and that it established and set China, reversed that revolution and set China on the road to capitalism. You know, now it's kind of obvious to people who don't know any political theory. It's obviously a big capitalist country, except for people who are really trapped in the past on this. But at the time he made this, there was no one else who really saw this and went very deeply at it. And that actually rescued the possibility of a genuine communist revolution for people all around the world. Even as many people at that point couldn't understand it, many got off the revolutionary road over the ensuing decades. But he, as you said, continued to deepen that. And I want to just say for our audience that they can learn more about this in the interview with you, whose title is "You Don't Know What You Think You Know About the Communist Revolution and the Real Path to Emancipation, Its History and Our Future." That's on the website, revcom.us. You can probably pick up a print edition at Revolution Books if you're in New York or Berkeley. And also, we want to recommend that people pick up the manifesto, The Beginning of a New Stage, a manifesto from the Revolutionary Communist Party. Both of these go into the great lessons of this period. So, Raymond, I want to thank you for this interview, and it's introduced people to a lot of really important history that they need to know as part of the path of preparing to go forward and emancipate all of humanity. So it was good to see you again, and thank you for this interview.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you and with the audience of the RNL Show.
For our final segment today, we have a very powerful installment of the American Crime Series. Twice in less than a month, news of horrific discoveries in Canada shocked the conscience of people around the world. In late June, in the province of Saskatchewan, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations announced the discovery of unmarked mass graves, 751 in all, filled mainly with Indigenous children. Shortly before this news broke of another mass grave in Canada filled with the remains of 215 children. Both of these were discovered near the sites of boarding schools, where Indigenous children had been kidnapped from their families, sent to these boarding camps to be robbed of their cultures, their languages, their family bonds. It was a form of cultural genocide. And the same thing was done in the United States. About 150,000 children were forced into these boarding schools for over a century in this country. This is one part of a larger story of a barbaric genocide through which this land was cleared so America could rise. Back in 2018, our website, revcom.us, shined a light on the atrocity of these boarding schools as part of our ongoing series, American Crime, which documents the 100 most heinous crimes committed by the United States. You can find there on revcom.us case number 40, Native American boarding schools, quote, kill the Indian, save the man. The filmmaker David Zeiger has been using his considerable skill to turn these American crimes into segments for the RNL Revolution, Nothing Less show, and we're very excited to be able to share with you the new segment that he has done dealing with these boarding schools. This is how we're going to close out our show today. It's a very important part of American history that we have to confront. It'll be the last thing we share with you today. So on behalf of myself, Andy Zee, and our whole team here, we want to say good night, and we'll see you back next week. And with that, let's watch American Crime, Case Number 40, Native American Boarding Schools. Kill the Indian, save the man.
How do you commit genocide? There's the old-fashioned way, outright slaughter. And when it comes to Native Americans, nobody beats the expanding countries of the United States and Canada. Credible estimates of the indigenous population in North America in 1492 are between 12.5 and 18.5 million. Through the combination of massive epidemics and the Indian wars waged by the U.S. Army through the decades after the Civil War, by 1890, the estimated Native American population had been reduced to fewer than 240,000 in the U.S., and in Canada, a third of that, a population reduction of 95 to 99%. But what about the remaining 1 to 5%? You can't just allow them to rebuild their decimated communities and reverse all your hard work, can you? Enter Colonel Richard Pratt, intrepid Indian fighter and former head of the Fort Marion military prison for Apache prisoners, who in 1892 declared, "A great general, Philip Sheridan, has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with that sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." In other words, assimilate the survivors, educate them to become suitable to be members of the society that had devastated and despised them. So in the 1860s, religious orders began setting up schools on reservations aiming to convert the children to Christianity. But the U.S. Indian Commission concluded that assimilation could not be successful as long as the children still lived at home and returned to their families at the end of each day. The answer? Remove the children. So from the 1870s to the mid-20th century, U.S. policy decreed that every Native American child would be taken from his or her home, family, community, and culture, beginning as early as 5 years of age, and sent to off-reservation boarding schools where they were to remain for up to a decade in state-sponsored educational facilities. As many as 500 Indian boarding schools in the U.S., 153 Indian boarding schools, and many more religious schools run by Christian denominations and paid for by the government. At its peak, this complex of boarding schools could hold nearly half of all Native American children at one time. A total of about 150,000 children ultimately attended these schools.
When the principal used to beat up the other children like boys, the boys got the most beating. They used to call it bench party, and it was usually done after supper. And that's where I got frightened, because I saw blood.
These places were run like military schools, marching to meals, and the virtues of patriotism and obedience were instilled. Education was designed to serve an extreme assimilationist agenda, aiming to inculcate subservience to Western values, like private property and me first. Some were self-described industrial schools that focused on training, not education. The young women learned to become maids and household servants or to work in commercial laundries. The young men were taught the skills needed to work for ranchers and farmers or for factory, mine, and mill operators throughout the western United States.
A devastating discovery has been made in Canada. The remains of 215 children have been found buried at the site of a former boarding school for Indigenous students.
Children were systematically found to be underfed and underweight. Together with forced labor, this caused staggering disease-driven mortality rates. Epidemics of deadly infectious diseases were common, including tuberculosis and at times smallpox. At the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, Of the 73 Shoshone and Arapaho children enrolled between 1881 and 1894, only 26 survived. A 1908 study by the Smithsonian Institution found that overall only 1 in every 5 students was likely to be, quote, entirely free, end quote, of symptoms of tuberculosis.
And I can remember the principal grabbing a hold of me by the hand, and I was jumping off the floor like that, and he stripped me. And he started whacking me with a long, webbed strap. He was setting an example that, if you do this is what's going to happen to you. And all the other boys are watching. And you learn pretty quick after getting those kind of beatings. Not strapping, it's literally beatings, And ever since that day, I tried to run away.
Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse of the children by those who ran these schools was widespread. Many of the youngsters died trying to escape the schools and return to their reservations. Those who were captured and brought back to the schools were brutally beaten. In fact, brutal physical abuse, torture, was brought down on boys and girls alike for any number of violations.
So that was the start of my indoctrination, where they say, kill the Indian and the child. That's exactly what they were doing. Killing. When you left the residential school, it was very, very isolated incidents where people would go back and live on reserve. We were gone.
In 1910, the U.S. Indian Commissioner described their policy as, quote, a mighty pulverizing engine for breaking up the last vestiges of the tribal mass, end quote. Slaughter, disease, and forced assimilation. That is how you commit genocide.